Anthony Marshall at IBM is the co-author of perhaps the book on ROI and thought leadership, and the latest big hitter from the world of content and research to grace this series. And actually, we had a great point of disagreement pretty soon in this episode. You see, you, like me and the team here at Collective Content, are likely a voracious consumer of content, quite possibly a prolific creator of content too. Well, he was teasing some research from the Global Thought Leadership Institute, where he's one of the leading lights, that found that CEOs spend 3 hours a week consuming thought leadership. And he simply pointed out that's quite a win for those of us producing the thought leadership content. And I concede now he was probably right. We also discovered how the most senior people in business use AI to consume content now, and, well, so much more. But before being a leader at IBM's Institute for Business Value, before even his days in consulting, Anthony's roots were in the public sector in his native Australia. So prepare for his story, his 5 key areas of thought leadership, and how the golden age of thought leadership is expanding beyond tech, consulting, and professional services. You know, the verticals that this agency tends to know the best. Anyway, it's time for this week's Sensemaker.
And now, as part of Collective Content's Sensemaker Sessions podcast, today's content leader is Anthony Marshall, Senior Partner, VP, Global Leader, IBM Institute for Business Value. With thanks to our sponsor, Highbeam Global, a global full-service market research firm. Today's episode was filmed in November 2025 at Spiritland Studios in London.
And I am now joined for our latest Sensemaker session by Anthony Marshall from IBM's Institute for Business Value. Anthony, welcome to the pod.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Got loads to talk to you about. You have come up in other episodes of this season. You won't be surprised to hear because of the work and the study that you and your sort of partner in crime, Cindy Anderson, have also worked on over the last. Well, you tell me how long. Over probably years that you've been doing this research. Too long. Okay. Yeah. So you've come up, but I've got lots of things to ask you. And I just wanted to, first of all, just go in with something about who you are, because you weren't always doing this, although you've been at IBM a long time. That's not an unusual statement to say to somebody from IBM. But tell us about your career, sort of both pre and then going into IBM.
Sure. So I've been with IBM a little more than 20 years. So for probably the first 10 years or so, I was consulting in banking, financial markets, sort of doing strategy and innovation, things like that. So you may have noticed that I don't really have a strong American accent.
I was trying to place your accent, and then it became obvious. Yeah.
I do live in Jersey City, opposite Manhattan. So I've been in the United States for about 30 years, but originally Australian. I'm still Australian. I became a US citizen in around 2008.
Okay.
I originally came for graduate school. And so I toyed with becoming an academic for a while. I realized I'd be a really, really bad academic.
Okay.
And so I decided to do other things. And, you know, what do you do when you can't succeed as an academic? Become a consultant, of course. And no. So that sort of combined a lot of my sort of skills together. And that sort of led to thought leadership. Back in Australia, before I came, my original career was in government.
Oh, okay.
Public sector. So I was working for the Victorian government for about 7 years in Melbourne, working on deregulation, privatization, big privatization program.
Oh, okay.
So I was working as a policy advisor and economist in that environment. And so that's helped with some of the analytical skills that I've relied on subsequently.
Yeah, I can see how those skills roll up into what you've become in more recent years.
Yeah.
My first inclination is to ask you if you miss any of it. So, you know, that sort of transformation in say public sector, the work you did as a consultant, Australia. Do you miss home? You can still think of it as home?
Well, in terms of the first part, so there were very heady days because a lot of the stuff that we were doing had never really been done before. The focus of that program, if you think about the monopolies that you sort of
Mm-hmm.
deregulate and privatize that were public sector. One way of approaching that is to sell the monopoly and make lots of money. We were sort of doing the opposite. We were sort of minimizing the value by trying to maximize the competitiveness.
Okay.
And so that was, really pure economics, if you will.
Yeah.
And so that was very exciting. Hadn't really been done before. And so, but that sort of level of transformation has really been a common theme in the work that I've done since, both in consulting and particularly around banking, financial markets, innovation, and as you'd know, transformation is very fundamental to thought leadership, certainly technology-led thought leadership. And so again, that sort of set me in a pretty clear direction in terms of what to achieve.
Yeah. And here we now find you. We're actually interviewing you in London, we should say,
Mm.
based in New York area, as you say. Your role is global now, so let's start talking about your team and what you do. You're traveling around a lot. You see the world, I guess.
Yeah. So IBM Institute for Business Value is IBM's business thought leadership group.
Right.
And so we're around 100 people. We cover all sorts of content areas. Technology is, of course, we're IBM, but also industries, different functional areas, HR, supply chain. And also we have a very large C-suite program. We also have a very big benchmarking practice
Mm-hmm.
that isn't actually open to the public, but it's a huge repository of data that we work with our clients, and they have access to. And so the team is very global. So we certainly have a team here in London, we're a team in the US, of course, but also really through Europe, Asia Pacific. We've got an IBV in Japan. IBV is the acronym for IBM Institute for Business Value.
Right.
In China and India. And so it really is a very, very global organization.
Okay. And how does that sit then with the rest of the organization? So, for example, who do you report into, and where does that the whole business unit report to?
Yeah. And it's a really interesting question you're asking, because in some ways it's a very loaded question for thought leadership, because where do you report to in thought leadership in an organization? One track is through marketing.
Yeah.
And so a lot of my colleagues in other organizations report up through their marketing organizations. We report through consulting. And so we've got a very close relationship with communications and marketing at IBM, but we report up to the head of consulting. And the consulting business is pretty big. It's one of the larger, if you just sort of hived it off as a consulting business, it would be one of the larger tech consulting businesses. So that's where we report, but we actually serve across the organization. So IBM Technology, IBM Research, and all the ecosystem of acquisitions and partnerships.
Yeah. And we asked this, as you can imagine, to everyone in this SenseMaker series, because there are a range of answers. I suspect, not to put words in your mouth, I suspect you're very comfortable with that setup and reporting into consulting.
Well, one of the things that we do as a team, and this has been around for as long as I've been in the IBV, is that our team have to spend half of their time producing content, but half of their time engaging around content. And so they need to work with account teams, they need to work with clients directly, have conversations, go and present. And so having a team that were once really experienced consultants from the consulting organization is very powerful, because they have all those skills. They can go in, they can get a meeting with a CEO and share some of our content. So it's new, it's something compelling that a CEO might be interested in, but they also have the skills, experience, and gravitas, if you will, to actually sustain that conversation with a lead, a chief executive or other member of the C-suite. And that's really our target. So that's actually skills that are critically important to our success.
Okay. And I imagine, again, tell me if I'm right or wrong, but you're always working with other parts of the business, and I guess sometimes partnering them with other companies, all kinds of other providers and partners of different sorts.
So in terms of producing content, we have a 2 in the box or 3 in the box, depending upon what sort of content it is. So if you think about IBM, there's sort of the consulting side, the technology side, and then there's the research side. So if you think about something like quantum computing, that's really driven out of research. Other areas of technology driven out of technology, and the consulting side that sort of brings it all together, if you will. And so in order to ensure that we have buy-in across the organization, we've got alignment, and also the stakeholder engagement to make sure that we deploy effectively. Because if you write it and then no one reads it, what's the point of that? It's really important. But certainly over the past several years, IBM has really pivoted very strongly into the ecosystem, open ecosystem. And so I think, I'm forgetting the actual number, but in the last 3.5 years, it's something like 60 reports that we've produced that have been co-branded with ecosystem partners. And that might be an SAP or an AWS, or if you think about the history of IBM, Microsoft, we co-brand with Microsoft, and Adobe and Oracle, for example, but also the industry, a big industry association. So here, we're in London, GSMA is in London, telco space. So we've co-branded several studies with GSMA and National Retail Federation and just across industries.
Yeah, I can imagine across industries, across countries, so global institutions. We know some of them. We know the GSMA.
Yeah.
I wanted to go into three main areas. So a little bit more drilling down on your sort of philosophy of how you do things, and we're going to get to AI, and then the big one around ROI. And some people listening to this will know why I'm saying it's the big one in your case. In terms of the philosophy, it's a little bit like in sports where a coach or a manager has a way of playing. And in our research, we sort of drilled this down to sort of 5 areas that you've spoken about. And I think it's worth saying what all 5 are. We don't have to go into depth on all 5. But you've talked about the concept of an idea lab. Secondly, you've talked about using original data and insight. Third up, storytelling and producing the content. Distribution models, which really importantly, you stress can be one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many, which is where you talk about campaigns. And then lastly, you talk about being consistent and business aligned. There's a lot there.
There is.
But it seems not everyone has to say it the same way, and some people might do things slightly differently, but at least having all that written down where everybody can see how you approach it, that seems incredibly important to me.
And it is. All of those elements are foundational, really fundamental to any thought leadership practice. And I'm talking whether it's one person or whether it's 100 people like us or possibly thousands like a McKinsey, right? Those aspects of the thought leadership operating model, if you will, are critically important. So if it's one person, they've got to do all those things. It's a really tough job, right? They've got to bring it all together. But they are all really fundamental, and technology has impacted each of them in different ways.
Yeah.
So if you look at the ideas lab, that's actually very abstract. How do you formulate ideas? How do you make it provocative? How do you make every study? This is something we grapple with every day. In fact, before coming here this morning, I was grappling this with my team here. How do we make every single study provocative and surprising?
Yeah.
Because a lot of stuff's been said. What do they say? There's only 7 different stories, right? How do you make it surprising? But that's the task.
Yeah.
And so some people are deploying AI to formulate ideas. I have not personally found that particularly successful. Maybe I'm just doing it badly. I don't know.
Well,
but
we might get to that.
Yeah. But conceiving those ideas is really challenging, and you need to focus time on it.
And then a moment ago, you were talking about a stakeholder, for example, using the content that's created based on all the rich data, etc. And that immediately made me think of a person, for example, going into a meeting. So this idea of all content having to be for large audiences, online, accessible, sometimes it's something that influences that one key decision maker, isn't it?
And it's a very interesting point that you raise, because if you think about what value you're driving, and you mentioned ROI a little earlier, and we'll come back to that. But if you think about ROI, just sort of broadly, how do you get value from the content that you're producing? So if you've got one client, and they're a really big client, and you've produced a piece of thought leadership and had an impact on that client such that that client is more willing to put whatever you produce, your organization, in the consideration space and the purchase space, then that is incredibly potent, just one client. Yeah. Now, if you're talking one-to-one, you've got to be clear to delineate what is thought leadership, what is consulting,
right?
Because it can turn into that. But then you've got this sort of alternate view of thought leadership, and they're not mutually exclusive by any stretch. But basically, thought leadership is something that drives brand. and drive sort of better appreciation of what sort of organization you are. And that may be impact in the media. It may be number of news headlines you get, et cetera, et cetera. What we've actually found, so I'm sure we'll get to this as well, but one of the things that I and Cindy were heavily involved with, certainly for the last couple of years, but a couple of years ago in forming, was the Global Thought Leadership Institute. And this is an organization that is dedicated to improving consistency, quality in the thought leadership discipline, basically developing a professional association such, very similar to what Project Management Institute did for project management 50 years ago.
Right.
And the certifications, building all of that. One of the things that the GTLI, I'm sorry to keep on using all these acronyms, Global Thought Leadership Institute, GTLI, that the GTLI has been is doing right now is producing a study, first study as producers. We've just got data back on that, and what we're finding is in a survey of 1,000 C-suite executives, of which half were CEOs, around 95% want to use AI to interrogate analysis and data from thought leadership they consume. And so when you think about the one-to-one, the one-to-few, the one-to-many, you've also got this sort of technology that's coming in, and it's 95% is incredibly high.
Yeah, and I get why it's incredibly high, but the real thing to underline here is this is about the consumption of content.
Yes.
So to drill down a bit more in those studies. So for example, I should mention your book.
Yes.
And this is co-authored by Cindy Anderson and yourself. This is the tome that a lot of people are waving around, not just me, like in a lot of these interviews. I must say I've read most of it, and it is great. And it is there's a lot of talking points in there. And I think any of your peers would love to sit down and talk to you about some of this. And obviously every organization is slightly different. Within that, there are certain things which really stick out. So, for example, the kind of the C-level audience consuming content. First of all, it's not a huge amount of time every week. It's give or take, it's about 3 hours on average, isn't it?
I think that's a huge amount of time.
You think really?
Absolutely. So you've got a CEO
Yeah.
and remember for that, in that we used a lot of data. Because in our view, in our definition of thought leadership, it incorporates data, right?
Okay.
Otherwise, it's not thought leadership.
Okay.
And we sort of did a lot of surveying, and we surveyed a lot of executives. So the average size of the organization that we surveyed for the book was $29 billion. So you think of the CEO of a $29 billion organization that spends 3 hours every week consuming thought leadership. That's remarkable.
Well, I live in a world people are very promiscuous with their content consumption. I'm sure you know what I mean.
Yes.
And the 3 hours, that struck me, and I take your point completely. And also being one of the sources that they tend to keep going back to, it's just 5 sources on average.
Yeah.
And that seems, so if you're in that 5, well done.
Yeah.
But if you're not, it seems like a pretty hard elite group to get into.
Yeah.
But you think that's maybe 5 is a lot, even is for some people.
Well, when you think about, and it's important that people realize it's not the same 5. So every executive, it's a different 5,
Sure.
and it's an average.
Yep.
So some executives will consume fewer than 5, some will be more, but the average is 5.
Okay.
But what this and they may spend 80% of their time on one source.
Yeah.
Right. And you just each individual is different. To your point, 5 organizations. It's if you want to have an impact on an executive, you need to be in that group of organizations that they consume. And if they're your client already, then that's half of the battle done, right? So if you're really targeting your clients very specifically in thinking, as the fundamental strategy of your thought leadership program, then that makes a lot of sense. Because getting into that 5, if you're not in the 5, you're not considered, you're not utilized, and nothing can really result from it.
Okay. Yeah. And just to be clear, when we talk about that 5, those are 5 any kind of publications. They could be The Economist as much as you guys.
We were pretty clear about thought leadership.
It's thought leadership. Okay, so it's pure,
less media.
Yeah.
So The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, they weren't in that selection set.
Okay.
It was really organizations that produce thought leadership
I see.
in the domain that the executive is interested in.
Okay.
So if you're looking at a McKinsey, for example, or a
Yeah.
BCG, that cuts across a lot of domains.
Yeah.
But then there are specialist organizations, law firms now are becoming increasingly prominent in the thought leadership
Absolutely,
domain,
yeah.
and they're producing thought leadership. And
Yeah.
so it would be consumers of, it would be maybe the chief law, what do you call them? Chief counsel.
Chief counsel,
Yeah,
in-house, or
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
That
partner,
would be the
yeah.
executive,
Yeah.
and often a C-suite role
Yeah.
in organizations.
So if you're not one of those 5 sources for the CEO now, how do you break into that 5?
So I think it depends what sort of organization you're at and what your clients are. And so, firstly, it's going to be a lot easier to break in if you're leveraging an existing relationship. And so, really focusing on your clients and getting a better understanding about what's of interest to them. And sort of with the alignment question, making sure that you're aligning the content with what they're interested in, but also what your organization is producing. I think if you really don't believe that you're one of the 5, I think that's the way of sort of thinking much more deeply when you start conceiving what sort of thought leadership should I could create, what topic do I have, what form should it take, what length should it take, what's the scope, etc. I think really thinking in terms of what's the easiest way of getting in that consideration set, and starting with an pre-existing relationship, I think is a good way to start it.
Okay, fascinating. Wow. So I think we're going to keep coming back to this. So that was a really great AI angle. In terms of creating content with AI or using AI around research, those areas, I'd love you just to sort of blank sheet of paper. What are you sort of most positive and negative about right now?
So if you think about the value chain of thought leadership, it goes, and we've talked about some of it already, from the instigation of an idea. What are you going to be talking about through research, through acquiring data somehow? We do a lot of proprietary primary surveying, and so I have a personal bias towards that. But interviewing, case studies are incredibly valuable, incredibly powerful as well, whatever it is. And then through the analysis phase to crafting, very clear narrative storytelling, writing, if you think about putting a report together and then having the derivative content that often, so people talk about shorter form content. In my view, that's great, but it's even more powerful if you've got something really substantial that the shorter form can derive from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then going through all the way through to engagement and promotion. And so if that's the value chain, then AI has and can intersect at all parts of that. So we already talked briefly about developing, generating ideas. But then in terms of survey development, we're actually using AI increasingly, generative AI, to help us formulate surveys faster based on the enormous corpus of data and the training that we already have in terms of surveys that we've already conducted.
So that's sort of pre-field work. We've spoken to people in this series about the classic kind of 6-week cycle of having to go out and poll so many people. The use of synthetic data, for example, is that something which you guys are looking at?
Yes, but carefully. So if you think of a major study, certainly at this point, if we think about our CEO study that we produce every year, typically we have 2,000 CEOs around the world. We're not going to decrease that because part of the selling point, part of the credibility is that we've got so many. But if you think about other sort of more exotic, if you will, or more narrowly defined content, or if you've got a large survey and you're interested in understanding more about a particular industry in a particular country, you may have a relatively small end count of that because it's just so expensive to do the survey. And so we are utilizing synthetic data in those specific instances. Now, with synthetic data, it's not a panacea. All right, and I find it very odd when organizations sort of say, come and buy synthetic data from us. I don't know how they would possibly do it.
Right.
It would be very curious to understand better because you need a baseline of real data
Right.
in order to model the synthetic data on, and it has to be individually calibrated
Mm-hmm.
to that source data,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not a simple process. And so you need very capable statisticians in order to do that effectively. We're doing that, but again, it's not something that is broadly usable,
Mm-hmm.
certainly yet.
Yeah.
At some point, and this sort of goes to the point of general intelligence and general AI. At
Right.
some point, we might be able to put our entire repository of data into a database, and start looking at that and modeling that. When I don't think we're there yet.
Okay.
Whether we are in a couple of years, who knows?
Yeah.
But certainly at this point, there are limitations that we need to be aware of
Okay.
in terms of the great benefits.
Interesting.
But
Yeah.
we're investing to learn more.
And you're the kind of organization that can do all of that yourself.
Yeah.
Right? You don't need to partner with external.
We partner with all sorts of organizations, but that's not an area that we would need to partner
Yeah.
in order
Yeah.
to do it. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about hyper-personalization.
Mm.
That's an area that you've been looking at too.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So what we found, another data point from this survey, this GTLI survey, is that I think it was 92 or 93% of executives want sort of a personalized view of content that they consume. So thought leadership content. And so we talked about the 5 organizations.
Mm-hmm.
This is sort of changing this a little bit because you just don't quite know how this is going to play out. But similar to, as I mentioned, I've been working in consulting probably since 98, right, in one way or another. And hyper-personalization has been this aspiration
dream
for as long as I've been in
Yeah.
consulting, right?
Yeah.
And we're finally sort of getting to a point where I think it's feasible because of the technology. And the hyper-personalization, you need a knowledge of the individual concerned
Mm-hmm.
because you need to understand who they are and what their objectives are, or some way of determining that. So like doing an individual survey of them,
Mm-hmm.
but then giving them access to the data, and the analysis in a way that's very usable and simple and compelling so that they can tell their own journeys. And so, when you produce a piece of content, it's almost like conversion to a mean. It's what you think is most compelling,
Right.
most narratively fulfilling, most relevant. But for each individual, there'll be deviation. So it allows the individual to formulate their own story. Has anyone done that really successfully in thought leadership yet? Not that I've seen. There've been attempts, but I think that's where it's going, and that's certainly where we're looking to invest as well.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by what different thought leaders or organizations using thought leadership, how they would personalize for the same person. That would be fascinating to me. If you were a CEO or head of something, and you were receiving different
Yes.
tones of whatever it is, every format under the sun, I wonder if they'd all see you as the same person. That's
Probably not.
and that tells you something as well, how that comes through to you. Yeah.
But it allows to the data point that I was mentioning earlier, it allows the individual to interrogate the analysis and interrogate the data
Right.
in any way that they want to.
Right. So it's that freedom to
Exactly.
then actually interrogate. It's not just
Exactly.
blindly consuming
Yeah.
the same thing. Okay. Really, really interesting. So the research that you've got, that you've been working on, the GTLI study, I know that's with several other people as well. So Liz Bolshaw at EY is one person that who you're partnering with, who we'll be speaking with in this series too, I should add. The big question, or one of the big questions I'm asking, is whether we're elevating thought leadership to a place where it can actually be the golden age of thought leadership. So to come back to your book again, a standout figure which I think raises people's eyebrows is the sort of stark ROI that is possible compared to other forms of marketing, essentially, to put it in simple terms. It's not the same for everyone, and there's lots of variables in there, etc. But the standout figures are huge. So could we be entering a golden age of thought leadership?
Yeah. So in terms of the book, the reason why we wrote the book is not because we wanted to write a book. We started building the analysis to justify our existence to our own organization.
Yeah.
Basically, IBM at that stage had invested in thought leadership IBV for probably 17, 18 years.
Mhm.
And it was justifiably asking the question, is this
Yeah.
creating value for us?
Yeah.
And I think we won the argument. And part of winning the argument was initially, at least, was to demonstrate that there was a positive ROI.
Yeah.
And in calculating the ROI for us, we thought this is incredibly useful and powerful, and we wanted to share it. Which is the first section of that book. And then I think you need more than that for a book. And then we started thinking, okay, well, what else do you need for a thought leadership or a successful thought leadership organization, which is what the book ended up being. But in terms of the elements, it's really recognizing that for an average organization, a typical organization, I think the number was 156% ROI. The secondary sources say that the ROI of a typical marketing campaign is in the single digits or very low double digits, right? And so when you think about that, all the money that's spent in marketing by organizations, the relatively little money that's spent in thought leadership, there is a huge opportunity to capitalize, as you mentioned. And so is it the golden age?
Or could it be the golden? Isn't it, rather than is it right now?
Yeah. It's not yet. I think right now the technology and the changing patterns in various industries are having a mixed impact on the creation of thought leadership.
Okay.
So you've got, I think you've got organizations sort of questioning, is the investment too much, too little? How do I get more value from the content? But at the same time, you've got many other organizations, whether we talked about law firms, for example, the real estate organizations, banks. You've got all sorts of organizations that may have been toying with, or there might have been a couple of players in those industries that did thought leadership, and now it's becoming generally accepted we should do it. And so the breadth of thought leadership across industries, I think, is expanding dramatically.
Yeah, it's really interesting for us, specializing in professional services and tech, because we speak to people like yourself and other great leaders, and it easily gets in our head that everyone's doing this. And then we start working with law firms. We've spoken to a bank in this series, and we're realizing that they're actually taking a lot of that learning from these sectors and bringing it everywhere.
Yes.
And that's and also I was smiling a minute ago because when you were talking about justifying what you're doing, it's not unique to everyone goes through that, right? So it's I can see how critical that is. I was really struck by one quotation. I'm quoting from Gen AI now. So in our research for these interviews, we talk to the AI gods at times. This one line about you, it said, he repeatedly makes the point that thought leadership is not a campaign, advertisement, or one-off piece. It's a long-term relationship and brand asset for B2B organizations.
I can't remember saying that so
No,
articulately.
I don't think I think this is ChatGPT, sort of summarizing
I
it
should
down.
get ChatGPT to write all my scripts.
Well, I was going to say I like that, and just to stress, we don't only rely on AI for all the prep here, but a little bit we do, and I particularly like that because we often say that thought leadership and branded content more generally is never a campaign. It's from now forever. And a lot of people don't always want to hear that. That sounds pretty daunting. But it feels to me like the best in the business are set up with that mindset and do make it work over the long term. Periodically, maybe quite frequently, you have to justify and you have to show the ROI. But it feels like that there is now an understanding that this is the way it is. And this is one of the most effective ways of being an effective organization.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a delineation here. So if you're a smaller organization and you produce a piece of content, you may only be able to produce one substantial piece of content a year.
Yeah.
And so we shouldn't diminish that, right? And so that's really important. And feeling I need to get value, derive value, and even measure the value from a piece of content that was a huge investment for you, completely justified. But I think what ChatGPT is saying here, and in my voice, is that even if that's the case, the philosophy underpinning that needs to be about the relationship with the client or clients. All right. So the motivation, you might need a really good piece of content or have a great piece of content that materially impacts perception of you. We talked about consideration set. We talked about, buy decisions and stuff, of which all this is important. It's really, really important to be independent of that in your thought leadership. But fundamentally, that's why you're doing it, right?
Yeah.
And but even if you have a very successful piece of content, it should always be about the relationship and driving overall decision making. If you forget that, then it really risks degenerating into product. It'd be like product placement in effect. And so the moment you do that, we know from our research, you will start failing in all of the things you want to achieve. The irony of thought leadership is if you try and sell, you'll fail. Yeah. If you don't try and sell, you will succeed, which is an incredible irony and hard for some people to get their heads around. But that's one of the key challenges and opportunities of thought leadership. That's why you talked about alignment earlier. That's why alignment with your organization, with your whatever they are, sellers, consultants, whatever, is so critically important, because unless you're heading in the right direction with them, because of this need to be independent and objective, it's gonna be a miss. You need to have that alignment to be able to perpetuate the independence and the objectivity and still and drive maximum value for you.
Yeah. And that seems pretty fundamental to me, that part of the alignment is the organization understands the whole tell, don't sell. We joke about the Hippocratic oath of B2B thought leadership, it being first, be useful.
Yeah.
And if you've got that mindset, then you can go on and do all these great things and be that trusted, that trusted relationship. Listen, we're nearing the end, like a couple of things to do. But one thing we ask everyone in this series is to cast your mind back to the sort of first few years of your career. And maybe that was during the sort of deregulation in Australia or going into consulting. Could this question inevitably becomes, what would you say to your 22-year-old self? But could you even picture the last few decades that you've had and how you've ended up in this position?
Not at all. I think as with a lot of young people, I didn't know what I really wanted to do. I had aspirations, and I think what I've found over time is that you gravitate toward, if you're lucky, you gravitate toward those things that you're actually good at. And so I wasn't, I tried to be an academic. I wasn't a very good academic. But combining sort of the analytical skills of that and the consulting skills and the other sort of understanding of industry and sensitivity of culture as well. Sort of bringing all this together is sort of what my job is now. And I couldn't have conceived that sort of job even existed back then. But I think if you're persistent, and if you work hard, and if you're lucky, then you will find your way into something that works for you, whatever that happens to be. I think I heard something. Should you follow your dream or do what you're good at? Personally, I think do what you're good at, and then the dreams will come.
I love that. That's great. That's fantastic. Listen, I wanted to just do a last shout out for this. So Cindy Anderson and Anthony Marshall, co-authors on the ROI of Thought Leadership, does what it says on the tin, calculating the value that sets organizations apart. It's the big yellow book that I'm constantly bringing out into interviews like this. I want to say thank you as ever to our audience, our sponsor, but especially thank you to you, Anthony Marshall, for being our sense maker today.
It's been wonderful being here with you today, and hope to catch up again soon.
Cheers. Speak soon.
Thank you.
This was the Collective Content Podcast, Sensemaker Sessions. Let us know what you'd like us to make sense of next.